thank you again, like for attending. We are going to cover here the future of water in a rapidly changing climate, and here there are a few keywords. So in addition to, of course, water, which is a topic that brought us together, it's the idea of climate change, but like this rapid climate change, which is the challenge and the novelty that we have to deal with. What we intended to do is we really formatted this as just a conversation, an interdisciplinary conversation from engineering, from the humanities, from planning and environmental science, on what brought us to the situation we're in right now, what that situation is, what is the work that is being done in this area, and how do we move forward together, because we are all in it together, to address the challenges that are part of what causes climate change, the consequences of climate change on water issues and access. So we all do some form of engaged research, and so we will try to weave in our work as we have this conversation. I see Rachel just joined us, so that's great. We're all here now. So Rachel, I was just introducing our panel, so right on time. And so what we're going to do is we're going to just very briefly introduce ourselves. We have 3 panelists, and then we'll jump right into questions, and just engage in this conversation. And the idea is to have a little bit of time at the end to also include some discussion with the audience. So I know that that's going to be kind of like asynchronous through the Q&A feature of this webinar, but we'll engage in that way. So Ahmet, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself in a couple of minutes, that would be great.
Okay, thank you, Moira. I'm a research professor at UIC. I'm an expert on machine learning, data science, and computer vision. I worked on wildfire detection and various methane leak or other volatile organic compound detection problems in the past. Thank you.
Thank you. Rachel.
Hi, I'm Rachel Havrelock. My initiative is the UIC Freshwater Lab. It is one of the few, if not the only, initiatives that looks at the interaction among people and water and infrastructure from a humanistic point of view. And we emphasize aspects of class and race and gender, as well as taking an environmental justice perspective on issues of shared water and adaptation amidst climate change.
Wonderful, thank you. And yours truly, Moira Zellner, an associate professor in urban planning and policy. I also have an appointment in the Institute for Environmental Science and Policy as a research associate professor. And I'm also the director of the Urban Data Visualization Lab at UIC. And I have 2 streams of research, 2 lines of research. One is I do computational modeling and other kinds of systems modeling approaches to complex environmental issues, coupling human and natural systems. And so I've focused a lot of my work on groundwater issues, and so groundwater modeling coupled with land use and land cover change, also looking at issues of flooding and how that intersects with land use decisions and policies, among other things. And then the second line is using some of those tools, those computational and other kinds of modeling tools, complex systems modeling tools, to work with stakeholders in developing these shared representations, these models together, so that they can also be part of understanding the system, the couple system, understanding how they are part of that system, how they affect the outcomes of that system. And then with that information, be able to jointly have conversations and deliberations about what should we do, what are solutions, and what are the trade-offs of these solutions, who wins, who loses, what do we do about that? So all of these different expertise that we represent come together in this conversation, and hopefully you will enjoy our back and forth on these topics. We're going to cover a range of different topics. And so what we'll do is I'll ask, I'm checking the time because we want to make sure we end on time, and again, with some room for discussion with everybody. But we have about 4 questions that we'll discuss, about 5 to 7 minutes each question among the 3 of us. And then we'll just open it up for everybody. So the first one is, we have been talking about sustainability, resilience, and climate change for about 40 years. But it seems we haven't been able to steer away from business as usual. What are the main barriers to true and meaningful transformation in relation to water? And how could we overcome these barriers? So who would like to start that one?
I'll jump in, Moira, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Okay, so when we think about the barriers, whether to knowledge or awareness, or I guess more importantly, getting things done, we first of all have to kind of start with what I like to call the problem of public optics, right? The way in which many of the most damaging systems are either completely outside of the public's gaze or grasp, or in certain times sort of hides in plain sight, so that we are confronted by a polluting industry, an exploitation of shared elements of the earth or a community. But the hiding in plain sight is that we lack a vocabulary or a language to really highlight the damage and the harm caused by aspects or continued fossil fuel and industrial pollution in the era of late capital. And part of that, like hiding in plain sight, is the naturalization of many of the most damaging systems as being an essential, like irrevocable, aspect of economics or policy or society. So oftentimes the things that like harm us in real time, and I just want to qualify the us for a moment, because whereas industrial pollution, whether industrial agriculture or straight up industry, it does damage us as humans. It does damage us as members of an ecosystem, but we do always need to qualify the us, because the damage and the burden is disproportionate and is inordinately, disproportionately carried by low-income communities of color who are either located right next to these factories or to the sites where the waste, flows. So, we're all being damaged by it, but it is important, especially when we try to reorient our gaze in order to see these things plainly and put the damage into mobilizing language. We really do need to start with those people who carry the greatest burden, and yet work tirelessly to bring attention to what their communities are experiencing, both to get some relief and some help, but also as a warning call to the rest of us. Because, for example, if the whole process of switching the water source and poisoning the residents of Flint, yes, Michigan, if that hadn't become a crisis known across the globe, that is not where that scenario would have stopped. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to lead pipes, we can elaborate after, but something very similar is happening right now in the state of Illinois, in University Park. We have our own Flint right here. And that is not a story whose emergency has been elevated to this level of crisis, although the residents of University Park are weathering it as we speak. So this is like a huge barrier. And because once you sort of get the methods down in order to appraise and articulate where the greatest damage to water systems and public health occur, the next barrier is getting that out there. Mm-hmm. So, you know, again, these are our systems of delivery of information. Mm-hmm. The press is pretty beleaguered, but hanging on. It's very hard to get pollution stories, you know, on television and large scale radio. And it's hard, it's slow, you know, to get these studies out through educational means to the general public. So, you know, a big barrier is that learning how to see these things, you know, learning how to appraise their damage and finding the way to speak out, or the avenue to speak out and broadcast that information. Just to add one more element to what I see as a barrier, which is maybe a little bit more in our control as researchers or people working on these issues in the public, is we also have a tendency, you know, to focus on one piece of a complex system. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that focus narrows the problem to such a restricted degree that how to act and how to address it becomes stymied. And I'll give one concrete example of this, something that I and my freshwater lab have been working on very hard of late. But this comes down to what gets called the controversy over so-called Asian carp. And so people are very worried about these voracious carp that can unbalance an ecosystem traveling up the Illinois River and entering into the Great Lakes. You know, I'm not saying we should throw open our arms and bring the carp in, but that focus on the carp, which is labeled an invasive species, means that there's a big rush, in particular by the Army Corps of Engineers, to put it blankly, to build a wall in the water to try to repel the carp, but allow barges to keep passing through the Chicago and Sanitary Ship Canal. Well, if you focus on a fish alone and you don't look at the barge industry and its role in accelerating climate change and polluting water, and you don't look at the structure through which Chicago offshores its wastewater all the way to the Gulf of Mexico and fuels a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, and all the damage to communities living along the Sanitary and Ship Canal, right? If you focus on a fish, then you get a solution such as that proposed by the Army Corps of Engineers, which is a minimum of $830 million to build a sophisticated checkpoint for carp that might repel them, but will keep a whole sputtering system upheld. So these are complex issues. And, you know, I guess people are kind of overwhelmed by the complexity of our time, but we really need to work on observing, appraising, and narrating, right, these scenarios of climate change amidst late capitalism as whole systems that need to be transformed, because there's no Band-Aid for this. Right. It requires the rethinking and the rebuilding of water systems and social systems at once.
Wonderful, thank you. This is just the first question, so it's going to be a wonderful conversation. Ahmet, how would you approach from your perspective, you know, the barriers to really making a dent on the status quo, because that's what it is about, right? It's like just fixating on the way we do things, and with a narrow focus on specific issues or problems without really having like a more systemic kind of view on climate change and the environmental problems that we have.
I guess the changes are happening slowly, and people are sort of adapting to the changes, and they don't see the waterfall coming.
Right.
We are approaching towards the waterfall. We are sliding, but they cannot see the waterfall, and that's the main issue. And I'm a data scientist, and in fact, the first application of the data science is to water pollution. John Snow detected the cholera outbreak in London by collecting data, and then he determined that water well, with the cholera bacteria. I mean, we can use data science and the tools that you have to inform the public that the waterfall is just around the corner. So that's all I can say at this point.
And so I will add to that, Ahmet, that like I'm kind of like in the middle the middle of you two, of Rachel and you. So I actually use complex systems modeling to try to represent that complexity in more relevant ways, but in also working with stakeholders so that they can, we create these tools with them, not for them, so that they are part of the discovery process, of the analysis process, of understanding.
Yes, they have to be, yeah.
Right, they absolutely need to be.
Yeah.
And so we are all in it together. We are all stakeholders, right? Researchers,
Right.
Scientists, humanists, and just the public, right? And so we have to come together to try to create this shared understanding of this complexity that we're dealing with, so that we can understand the ripple effects that Rachel is talking about, or the waterfall that's coming. Mm-hmm. And then with that understanding and shared understanding, we can also have a platform that informs our discussions, that is not just opinions, right? It's a little bit more informed than that. There's evidence for that. There's modeling, there's data, and expert knowledge of all different kinds, including that of the public, which is so important, coming together to try to advance that conversation and that solution building capacity. But right now, what going into the barriers again, is that we see this fixation on, for me, the aspect as a system thinker and systems modeler is, and as a biologist and ecologist also by previous training, is that there's this idea that we can just grow, we can just keep growing, and it's okay. We can keep the growth going, and we'll figure it out. We'll find out a technology that will help us jump over the waterfall and land smoothly on the other side. And that's just not reality. And so we've got to restructure this social and economic system together with the infrastructure system that supports it, in a way that allows for adaptation to that notion of there is a limit. There are many limits, actually, and we have to just make sure that we stay within them. Otherwise, we just are going to be facing a lot of trauma and in the adaptation that will occur whether we want it or not. So better do it in a managed way than in a traumatic way.
Moira, can I ask a quick question of each
Sure.
of you?
Yes, absolutely.
So Ahmet, first to you about the important role of data science. So help me through this, because something like public water quality data is very important, right? How can we know what's compromising our drinking water without those vital studies? But I've been noticing a trend of lag, where sometimes there are years of waiting, both from municipal, publicly held drinking water systems that are more accountable to the public. And it's all the more acute when it comes to privatized systems, which are historically less answerable to the public. But I've been noticing this lag in the publishing of this data, so that sometimes you're waiting 2 years to get the data, right, that you needed 2 years ago. So, you know, like when you're looking for the 2020 report, the best you can do is maybe 2017, 2018. So as a data scientist, right, with this lag and what the information the public is receiving about their drinking water systems, do you have any recommendations? And then if I can give one to Moira too, which is also singing your praises a bit, I remember that one of your projects is an app for developers, so that everyone can see if we keep paving over cities and suburbs and rural areas, right? If we keep spreading the impermeable surface, the kind of urban flooding we'll be looking at. So yeah, kind of maybe if you would speak to that a little bit, and how to get something like that kind of visualization out there a bit more. So those are my questions for each of you, if I can pose them.
Sure.
I mean, governments, local governments, you know, they can use computer systems which have internet access. So as long as they get the data, they can put it into post it on internet. Then if we have, I mean, that may not be visualizable but by ordinary people, but if we can develop apps and software, we can visualize them and we can track the progress, but they have to have transparency and they have to put the data on internet. If they don't put it on internet, then public cannot see it.
Correct. And so one of the things, so the app that Rachel is referring to is a model that we developed to, it's a process-based model. So it means that it represents the process of flooding. And it's spatially explicit. So you can actually see a neighborhood and see how flooding occurs in that neighborhood in different conditions. So we have like the baseline, like whatever the condition is right now. And then we can play with different storm types and intensities. We can also play with different scenarios of green infrastructure. So we put green infrastructure of different kinds. How does that make a difference? And we've used that to, first of all, us understand that system. And so what happens at the neighborhood level when you put in green infrastructure, how much green infrastructure do you need? How do you need to locate it in space to actually make a difference? And we saw that those things matter. And we've actually used that model to inform green infrastructure plans in our campus and in different neighborhoods in the Chicago area. And we've also validated the model with data, and it works really well. But the more important part of it that I think Rachel is alluding to is that, again, we developed this, of course, with our understanding, our knowledge. We worked with hydrologists too to make sure that the hydrology was well represented and all of that. But we also worked with stakeholders who were affected by flooding, and organizations, non-for-profits that care about the communities who are facing flooding, And so they helped us also make sure that we represented the social parts of the system that were relevant to people. And that had to do with things like, you know, the cost effectiveness of green infrastructure, had to do with like the damage to property. And then for whom, right? Some people are not damaged, but some other are. And so how do we create solutions that we can all, you know, pitch into, like, you know, contribute to, even if it doesn't benefit us directly, but it benefits our community and it benefits other people, because other people are taking the brunt of the runoff that also comes from my property, even if I'm not being flooded, right? And so that kind of conversation, I think, is important, precisely to the point, Rachel, that you were making about making things visible. And it's not just about making flooding visible, because flooding is very visible already, but what is not necessarily visible is what causes it. So this is a way, and what areas cause it, so that you can see, well, if I'm paving upstream, it's going to cause damage downstream. But, you know, most people, when they do their development in their site, they're not necessarily thinking about that. Now there is new legislation in Cook County that forces people to think about that, but that was, fairly recent, considering, timelines. But in addition to that, it's like how water flows through the landscape so that we can plan for approaches to address that, better, but at the same time also looking at the social complexity. We are a diverse set of people who have diverse preferences. Maybe I don't care about property damage. Maybe I care more about, the disruption to the road network, or maybe I'm a public official and I care about making sure that I can do whatever I can do with the budget that I have, but I'm constrained by that budget, right? And so therefore I'll make decisions differently. I'll prioritize things differently. And so there are all of these conditions that make that social landscape also complex and something that has to become visible so that we can compromise more effectively, so that we can deliberate more effectively and innovate more effectively. So that's the important part that I see of what is needed. So thank you for that question. And maybe with that, I don't know, Ahmet, if you want to go on with a question. If not, I have, a few others, but it is already 2 p.m. And so I just want to make sure that we have a little bit of time also for participants. But Ahmet, I want to give you the opportunity to pose Rachel and me a question.
I see.
Sorry to put you on the spot like that.
Okay. I mean, we have to communicate the message to the people. Rachel, what form of communication channels should we have?
Great question.
Yeah, it is a great question. And it's something I think about and work on quite a bit. The mode that I've taken up in recent years is digital storytelling. So my lab in 2017 released a 12-story tour, if you will, through Lake Michigan waters. And that is called freshwaterstories.com. And in a small world coincidence, Timothy Oravec, who's on this call, is the writer of the first story of Freshwater Stories. So for that project, a team of researchers circled Lake Michigan and did community-based research. So speaking with community members of very different locations all around Lake Michigan about their priorities and their solutions. So we created a digital platform that informs, gives suggestions for how to get involved, and has a kind of a mini curriculum, an interactive curriculum that is called Source, Path, and People, so that anyone, anywhere in the world can go on the site and begin to investigate the source of their water, the path it takes to reach them, so all of that essential infrastructure of water, and then people. To whom are you connected because you share a water source, even if you're in a scenario of conflict with those people, right? Even if there's a yawning race or class divide between you. So the reason I like digital storytelling is that it's shareable across social media and across the internet. This, right now, the Freshwater Lab is working on another digital storytelling site all about the Chicago area waterway system. And that will launch in early December. It's called the Backward River, to draw attention to the fact that the Chicago River is the first river in the world to have been reversed. And so I've really enjoyed this process, and I've been working with a lot of students, and they've been doing a lot with podcasts, with audio vignettes. So I think especially in communicating to younger people, and then especially under our crazy pandemic conditions, that this digital form of media and storytelling can circulate, really, really well. Because again, this comes to me from journalists I know and students I know who study media and journalism. it is considered in the media world, climate change issues are considered a hard sell. And so that, I think, is an implicit bias in media markets that has to be thought through. But I also think, so that's what I'm doing. I'm using the digital medium because it's relatively inexpensive. You can use grassroots distribution systems. And, you know, when you can get the attention of mainstream media outlets, you can also show them a multivocal platform in one sitting. But I think when it comes, again, back to the visibility question, you know, there needs to be a push because, I mean, there even needs to be a change in the way the weather gets reported, right? Because, like, you know, this is a way, even when you listen to weather reports on television or on the radio, you know, it normalizes and naturalizes the crazy out of proportion things that are happening in our world. I mean, okay, the pandemic, I'm no public health expert. I work on water, but the fires in the West, I mean, the number of punishing storms and hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico, you know, our own Dorijo storm in this area in the summer, like these are crazy once in a lifetime things that are now quite prevalent.
Right.
So I think, you know, we also have to turn to all of these occasions and press on it, really use our research, use our knowledge about communication to say, hang on, you know, you've got to tell people this is, you know,
right.
Saying that it was 2020 was the rainiest year Chicago ever saw, you know, right after 2019, there needs to be an explanation there, and there needs to be life change decisions communicated there, and there needs, exactly as, you know, Moira and I were saying, there needs to be like systemic analysis and appraisal at every moment you speak about a storm or a fire,
right,
or a flood.
So if I may piggyback on that, and I don't know if Ahmet, if you had another question, but like just to kind of build on what Rachel is saying, I think that what is important there is not just that it's being normalized and kind of like not looked at it in context of like, this is happening, these storms, these fires are happening because all of this is happening. But I think that maybe also like the reason why it's not conveyed in that manner is because then we go and like, okay, but then what do we do? Right. And so it's like not to fall into like the hopelessness and the polarization actually that exists, not around the issue, because I think that at this point, the majority of people are either concerned or very concerned about climate change. Yes, you have people who don't, but they really are the minority right now. But the thing is,
except that they run the oil industry.
Right. but the thing is like, what do we do about this? And that's also, and that conversation cannot even start if we don't make this other contextualization happen, right? Which is like, well, but we are in a crisis and we've got to do something about it. How can we talk about it when we don't even say we've got to do something about this because we are in a crisis? So I think that they actually have to kind of like come together in one way so that we can really have space for this conversation, make things visible, give it a vocabulary, like Rachel was saying, name it, and it will become reality, right? And then it's something we can deal with. But if we don't even talk about it, how are we going to do this, right? So it has to become part of the conversation, but not just a conversation about the problem. It's a conversation about, okay, but what do we do about this? How do we move forward?
So maybe let's take a few moments just with the three of us and then open it up to everyone who's here. Let's like take a minute about the what should we do? You know, maybe we could each say a few things about, you know, especially when it comes to water, but not only, what are those solutions that have emerged from our research? Moira, why don't you go? Because you said we've got to bring in these solutions.
I do. And the thing is, like, I'm still trying to figure out what degrowth means in practice. But I think that ultimately it boils down to that. We've got to make a distinction between development and growth. Growth is not the way out of poverty. We clearly have seen that. Okay. Growth is not the way out of just lack of access to resources. It is not. It is costly. It is detrimental for everybody. And so we've got to figure out what this emerging discussion about degrowth means in practice, and how can we ensure prosperity without growth? How do we uncouple these two things? Because they're different. They're different. And all our metrics are about growth. And again, as a system thinker, if you look at system theory and applications to environmental issues and social issues, we all talk about the same thing. There are limits. You can't live beyond those limits. And so we've got to figure out a way to adapt to that reality. And paradoxically, we are focusing on the wrong things. Instead of focusing on the stock of natural capital, social capital, etc., we're focusing on this flow, this growth. Growth is a flow, it's not a stock. And so perpetuating growth or expanding growth is not the way to ensure the stability of our stocks, of our natural and social and infrastructural stocks. So it's important to really reframe this whole conversation about what prosperity means, what well-being means.
Ahmet, what about you? What are some of your thoughts about systemic solutions?
Actually, I want to point out something about the wildfires, and it actually ties with Rachel's water quality research. People, with the degrowth, I mean, or with the growth of the economy, people started building suburbs in forests or the bushlands in California or places like that, because the area is less populated and there is greenery. Okay, but of course, when you cover the natural habitat with pavements, and then people, they just throw away things, cigarette butts and so on and so forth, you increase the number of wildfires, and and then things get out of control after some time. You not only pollute the water, but also start the wildfires.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, so we do have.
Or can I take one more? Can I say?
Oh, sure.
I'll be brief because we're coming to the end, but I would add to what everyone says: decarbonizing. We've got to transition off fossil fuels as a source while making provision for those people employed in those sectors to be the first trained and employed on the transition to the new economy. And I will also say that in particular, the past 4 years of deregulation of water safety and quality standards have shown us how we need to devolve water governance from federal to more local levels, to watershed levels. So, we've really seen those of us who live on the shores of these remarkable freshwater seas, the Great Lakes, we have really seen the need for those of us whose lives and futures depend on these waters. We've got to come up with a regulatory and governance structure that keeps in mind our well-being and not, political stances and promises made to corporate supporters. So that, especially because I imagine we have attorneys in training on the line, we really need to look to water law and governance structures to come up with a way that when we have federal government hostile to environmental protection, that we are not left exposed and endangered.
Exactly. That's exactly right. I know we have very little time, but I did want to give participants an opportunity to pose questions. So there's a Q&A application here for this conversation. So please feel free to drop a question or two that hopefully we can address in the last few minutes of this session. while you do that, I did want to say that, you know, what you're saying, Rachel, is absolutely true. But it can also happen at the local level, right? So the federal level, the purpose was that they could oversee, you know, like, and have precisely that system view that may not happen when the view is too localized, right? But now we see that shifting, where the federal level is not really looking after our interest or at the system's interest beyond certain sectors of interest, right? Like for example, the corporate. And so that, like, how do we build in protection so that we don't become vulnerable to any of those things, either a very narrow interest in self, you know, local areas, but also narrow interests in sectoral areas at the federal level as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's where I think, you know, to follow the watershed, because water itself, as you know, Moira, so well, I mean, both of you, you know, water itself is interconnected in a watershed or a basin. And so I think, you know, in particular in the era of accelerated climate change, basin level governance, regulation, oversight, research is just so vital, because nobody cares about your source of water, you know, as much as you, plural, right? All you people that draw from it do.
Right.
And I think that when we think about those shared interests by everyone who shares a source of drinking water, you know, we get the kind of urgency that we need to build institutions to protect watersheds, ecosystem stability, and human health.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I don't see any questions. So either everybody's completely enthralled by our conversation. I hope that's the case. But it is 2:16, and I know Timothy has to, you know, transition to another session. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ahmet and Rachel, for this wonderful conversation. I wish we could have it in person. I wish we could do it for many more hours than just 45 minutes. But hopefully we'll get the opportunity soon. And thank you, everybody, for being here and attending, and hope you enjoyed. So thank you.